probably the second most popular vehicle that I have, even though the only other vehicle or video that it's ever been in was about a 20-second clip of it just idling and me walking around getting some of the exhaust sound. Not terribly impressive, but some people seem to be interested in it. Before we get into the rest of it, turbos and such, I'll just kind of outline the original build, the state it was in when I did take that first video. It now has a 500 cubic inch motor. I pulled it out of a 75 Cadillac that I had. This originally had the 472. And when I pulled the 500 out of the other car, I figured if we're going to go to the trouble of swapping this engine in, I was going to do a little bit of performance type work to it. So I wasn't just swapping in a bigger motor, which actually has probably less compression or compression ratio as the old 472 that came out of it. I had a couple studs that broke off of the exhaust manifolds when I pulled it out of the other car, and I brought them to a machine shop, and I figured if somebody's going to touch the heads, we're going to do some work to those as well. There was an outfit that sold, they're actually heads out of an Oldsmobile, well, valves out of an Oldsmobile. Stock, this has, I believe, 2-inch and 1.5-inch intake and exhaust valves, so they're definitely not meant for breathing a lot of air. This engine was kind of designed just to run from idle to 4,000 RPM, and that's where all the torque and horsepower are in the original engines. I had the exhaust or intake and exhaust cut out to fit, let's see, I think the Oldsmobile valves are 211 and 177. I could be wrong there. I think it's been probably close to 10 years since I did all that work. I might have done a little bit of hand porting on the heads, nothing too invasive. What I did do was upgrade the valve train, which is notoriously weak, basically over 4,000 RPM. They kind of have a Chevy-ish valve train where you have a stud and the rocker mounts on the stud, and the pedestals on them are just weak and tend to break off with excessive RPM. So there was an outfit that sold a roller rocker setup that uses the bosses for the old pedestal setup, but it mounts a girdle, and then the rockers are mounted to there, which are supposed to solve the weak valve train. I haven't really pushed this thing much above 4,000, so whether it did or does help remains to be seen. I got a hold of an Edelbrock single plane intake to replace the old cast iron unit, which is really heavy and sits way down in there, so doesn't necessarily promote airflow in stock form. I had to get these aftermarket fabricated valve covers because the stockers just aren't big enough to fit over the roller rockers under there. So aside from the larger valves and the intake manifold and the larger valve covers, I got a hold of a set of copper head gaskets from what, Total TCE, but they actually dropped the compression even further. This engine was probably about an 8.5, 8.6 to 1 motor, and I imagine now it's probably closer to about 8.25. Which at the time made sense to me because boost on a carbureted engine generally has lower compression just because you don't have the electronics to manage ignition and fuel delivery. Let's see, I bought a set of their mid-length headers that took a bit of finessing to fit on this side. The brake lines had to be kind of rerouted for them to fit, and I just fabricated a big Y pipe and actually used a NASCAR type boom tube exhaust, if you know what that is. Just a big flattish exhaust tip that ran out the side, and it sounded pretty good. But eventually the transmission gave out and it got parked for years and years. Once I got around to yanking the transmission out, I knew I wanted to build something more powerful. The original 500 with the intake and larger valves and cam made about 350 horse and I want to say 475, maybe close to 500 pound-feet. So a little bit off from, say, the best of the 500s, which would have been the 70s with their higher compression, but probably not too bad considering that my compression ratio is down as far as it is. So I pulled it in the shop one winter, yanked the transmission, sent it out to the transmission shop to be built a little better than stock. Plus, I planned on putting a slightly higher stall converter in it. And then while it was in the shop waiting for the transmission to be done, I kind of got the bug and decided that this needed twin turbos. So here we have the twin turbo set up in all its glory. When I decided to turbo the Cadillac, I had collected a number of parts in order to make it work on the Cadillac itself. I've had a set of they're kind of shorty hot rod headers that actually had unfortunately a T3 exhaust flange on them, or they might have started out with a T4, but the only pair of turbos that I had came off of an eBay turbo kit that was meant for originally another project, which was a 305 in a Gen 3 Camaro. So these are definitely undersized for the application, but since I'd only be spinning this engine to maybe 4,000, 4,500 in a pinch, I figured they'd probably still be able to provide the airflow without bottlenecking too much in those little turbines. So with that in mind, I had to modify those headers because they were originally meant to be mounted downward or kind of underslung, and when I reversed them and faced them upwards, the angle put it into the valve cover, so I had to cut away the primaries, lay it out, do some welding, to get some space in between the valve cover and the header itself, and it is still pretty tight, but it works. Like I said, the wastegates, the turbos, and a bunch of the plumbing came from another kit. I had originally planned on running the exhausts out the fenders, but in order to run each one would have entailed a whole lot of fabricating that I wasn't prepared to get into, because you can't go straight across the fender here because the hood sets very nearly right on top of that. And then you've got the hinge here. I can't go by the hinge, so I would have had to run it down through here by the brake booster and then out the side, and I would have had much the same dilemma on the passenger side. So in the interest of convenience, I just routed them back over the engine, cut myself a hole in the hood, and these pipes are just slightly below the hood itself once it sets down. And I've made this little aluminum piece that once you lay the hood down and latch it, you just wiggle it around and it sets over the top and helps to route the exhaust out of the engine bay. I originally started with a blow-through carb that I had had on other projects. It was an older unit, and eventually I just kind of gave up on it. It's easier to do, well, not easier, but it's easy enough to get everything correct for wide open throttle, but the drivability was just something I could never work out, not being proficient enough with carburetor tuning. So I had this Phytech, and eventually I threw that on there, and it has been working pretty well. I haven't had it on the dyno or anything, but as far as fire up and AFRs, just as it's idling and with part throttle, it seems to be working quite well. I may have a little too small a fuel return line, and a lot of times that'll give you trouble if it's actually bottlenecking around the regulator. But we'll see in the future. The old HEI ignition is, well, the ignition itself is controlled by the Phytech software, but in order to use this HEI type ignition, I had to buy a special kit that you pull the guts out of the distributor. As you know, the coil is usually inside, but you have to separate those in order for the computer to be able to control the ignition. So this is what I ended up with, one of these MSD kits to rework or retrofit the distributor itself. Let's see. I wanted to keep most everything under the hood, which I ultimately failed at, having to run the exhaust through there, but wanted to be minimally invasive. I didn't want to have any cutouts in the hood to fit the turbos on here, so they're pretty low slung as best I could manage. You can see maybe a couple scars when the motor rocks back and forth, and there's a couple dimples on the top of the hood. These two right here specifically are actually just from this clamp here, which I'll eventually roll under so that those points aren't facing up. So in attempting to keep everything underneath the hood, you can see I had to cut out the inner fender well in order to get my intake piping somewhere where I could get a decent filter on it without bringing it up here and having to cut away sheet metal on the hood. This fuel pump was kind of added in after the fact. I've got an electric fuel pump on the back which managed the fuel supply duties while there was a carburetor on here, but once I went to the fuel injection, obviously I needed higher fuel pressure. So the old fuel pump, electric fuel pump that I mounted in the rear, feeds this higher pressure unit here, and at the time I didn't have all the fittings that I needed to drop this down in there a little more nicely than what we've got rigged up here. I'll square that away one of these days, but I managed to keep everything below. Had to make a couple cuts in the core support. Let's see, this coming from the intercooler. Had to make another cut there, and then I've got my battery charger on because it does have a bit of a parasitic load, and I left the cable attached the other day. But our other inlet pipe, or inlet pipe for the other turbo, just runs off in here. Hopefully this metal mesh doesn't contact much of any hot wires in there. We'll see. Oh, and the tiny compressor outlets from each turbo. I got this one running across here, you can see, and then just kind of joins in this ugly header to run into the intercooler there, which is sandwiched fairly well. I didn't have to do a whole bunch of cutting in there to get it to fit in front of the radiator and then within the confines of the core support and whatnot. So, aside from the engine modifications, I obviously bought a different set of wheels for it. They're a 17-inch, obviously solid steel wheel, and that thing is heavy. But I've got 275s front and rear. The rears are a drag radial, which at this point doesn't make a whole lot of sense since she's pretty much peg-legged, a one-wheel wonder. The body is not the nicest, obviously, and maybe at some point in the future it'll get a little bit of attention, but the old vinyl gave up the ghost several years ago. Driving along and suddenly heard the flop, flop, flop. Jumped out and just tore it off of there. I've plugged up some of the holes with this fancy ducting tape, but I think I'm going to end up cleaning up the rust, maybe bondoing some of these spots where the rust underneath the vinyl really did a number on the sheet metal there, but smooth that over, probably with some body filler and whatnot, clean it up, mask it off, and I'll probably just do a truck bed liner spray job on it to kind of give me a faux vinyl again. I've been dinking with this. The main thing I have to try and make work is the old trim, because obviously it's not going to look very good mating up to the paint or the truck bed liner that is obviously so much thinner than the original vinyl. But we'll figure it out one way or the other. Same with the rear window trim. It's going to take some doing to make the mating of the two look acceptable. Not that I'm terribly worried about fit and finish, but that is what it is. Oh, and aside from the different wheels I've got on this, I went and bought a set of 3-inch, I want to say 3-inch, they might just be 2-inch drop coil springs front and rear, and the outfit kind of custom makes them. So I asked for the drop plus the largest coil material they could come up with, and I think they came back with about a 30% over coil, so there's a little more stiffness in the ride, which is good because it was kind of low before, but with that extra 2 or 3-inch drop, I forget, she's really low now, and there's mainly the transmission pan is in danger of mechanically contacting the ground if I'm not careful. I think I'm going to end up building a skid plate for it, just in the hopes of protecting that transmission pan in a worst case contact scenario. When it was just going to be carbureted, I built this ugly gauge pod here for all the gauges that I would need or thought I would need for this setup. And then this box here houses, well, originally housed the ignition and a couple other ignition boxes. There was a start step retard, and then one was a boost controller for, you know, carbureted turbocharged vehicles, both of which went away. I've got some power distribution here and a whole bunch of switches that allow it to work. This is now my display for a lot of the gauges that became redundant once I went to the fuel injection. So I may clean this up as time goes by, but at this time it's still doing part of its job. So that's the Cadillac. If you have any questions on something that I haven't mentioned, I'm sure I glossed over plenty of things about the build itself. Just hit me up with a comment, and I'll try and cover anything I've left out.